A group of school bullies dared each other to trip a marching royal guard, thinking he'd be an easy target who wouldn't react. But when one boy actually went through with it, the guard's response caught everyone off guard and left a lasting impact on the teenager who tried it. This is what happened when a moment of disrespect turned into a lesson none of them would ever forget. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another powerful royal guard story you won't want to miss. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings in London when the air carries just enough bite to make you pull your jacket a little tighter. The kind of morning where tourists flock to Buckingham Palace with their cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd that day was a school group from a private academy in West London, their burgundy blazers marking them as students from one of those institutions where entitlement often masquerades. As education. At the center of this group stood Jason Harrington, a 17-year-old who had perfected the art of making others uncomfortable. His blonde hair was deliberately tousled in that expensive way that screams rebellion while costing more than most people's monthly salary. Jason had the kind of confidence that comes from never facing real consequences, the kind that makes you believe the world exists for your entertainment. His phone was already out, recording as he whispered mockingly to his friends about the guards marching in perfect formation along the palace perimeter. "Look at these guys," he snickered, zooming in on one particular guard whose posture was so rigid it seemed almost supernatural. "Robots in funny hats. I bet they don't even know we exist." The guard in question was Guardsman David Mitchell, though Jason had no way of knowing his name or anything else about him. All Jason saw was a tall figure in the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, marching with mechanical precision along the palace wall. What Jason couldn't see were the scars hidden beneath that immaculate uniform, or the medals tucked away in Mitchell's quarters that told stories of courage under fire. Mitchell had been walking this same route for 3 years now, ever since returning from his final deployment in Afghanistan. The rhythm of the march, the weight of the rifle on his shoulder, the feel of the cobblestones beneath his boots, it had become meditation for him, a way to quiet the memories that sometimes roared too loudly in the silence of his small flat. In Pimlico, Jason's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was doing her best to provide historical context about the palace and its guards. But her voice was competing with the excited chatter of teenagers who were more interested in their social media feeds than British military tradition. She had been teaching for over 20 years and had seen countless students like Jason, bright enough but lacking the life experience that breeds genuine respect for others. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace forecourt as Mitchell continued his measured pace. His mind, trained through years of military discipline, was simultaneously alert to his surroundings and focused inward. He could hear the tour groups, the clicking of cameras, the occasional shout from a street vendor. All of it was background noise to someone who had learned to find calm in the chaos of a war zone. Jason, meanwhile, was growing bolder by the minute. His initial comments about the guards had earned him snickers and appreciative nods from his classmates, feeding an ego that was already oversized. He began narrating for his phone camera, adopting the tone of a nature documentary presenter discussing some exotic species. "Here we see the British Royal Guard in its natural habitat," he whispered theatrically, following Mitchell's movement. With his camera, notice how it maintains perfect posture, despite having no apparent brain activity. Scientists believe they survive purely on tea and blind obedience to an old woman in a crown. His friends erupted in stifled laughter, the kind that comes from knowing you're being inappropriately loud in a place that demands respect. A few tourists turned to look disapprovingly at the group, but Jason thrived on any kind of attention, positive or negative. What Jason didn't know was that Mitchell had exceptional hearing, a skill honed during night patrols in Helmand Province, where the difference between hearing an approaching threat and missing it could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Every word of Jason's commentary was reaching him clearly, but his expression never changed. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to provoke him during his duties, and military training had prepared him for far worse provocations than a teenager with too much privilege and too little sense. Mrs. Henderson, sensing trouble brewing, tried to redirect her students' attention to the architectural features of the palace, but Jason was too caught up in his performance to listen. His phone screen showed dozens of likes already accumulating on his live stream, and the comments section was filling with fire emojis and laughing faces. The validation was intoxicating. As Mitchell approached the corner where he would turn to continue his patrol route, Jason made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The timing had to be perfect. He needed Mitchell to be close enough to the crowd that everyone would see what happened, but not so close that the other guards would immediately intervene. Jason positioned himself at the edge of the cordoned area, his phone still recording, and waited. Mitchell's boots struck the pavement in that hypnotic rhythm. Left, right, each step perfectly measured, perfectly timed. Jason's friends sensed something was about to happen and pressed closer, their phones also coming out, now to capture whatever their ringleader had planned. The dare had started as a joke among the boys during the bus ride to the palace. "I bet you couldn't make one of those guards break character," his friend Marcus had said. "They're probably trained not to react to anything." The challenge had lodged itself in Jason's mind like a splinter, growing more irritating and more tempting with each passing minute. Now, as Mitchell drew closer, Jason could see details that hadn't been visible from a distance. The guard's face was weathered in a way that suggested he was older than Jason had initially thought, probably in his early 30s. There was a small scar visible just above his collar, and his eyes, though fixed straight ahead, had a quality that Jason couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the vacant stare he had expected from someone he had mentally dismissed as a robot, but Jason was too committed to his performance now to back down. His social media followers were watching, his classmates were expecting something spectacular, and his pride wouldn't let him retreat. He took a deep breath, timed Mitchell's approach, and at the exact moment the guard would have passed directly in front of him, Jason lunged forward and stuck his foot out directly into Mitchell's path. What happened next occurred so quickly that it took several seconds for everyone watching to process what they had seen. Instead of Mitchell tripping over Jason's outstretched leg, something else entirely happened. With reflexes that seemed to defy physics, Mitchell simply stepped over Jason's foot without breaking stride, without even appearing to look down. Jason, thrown off balance by his own momentum and the unexpected failure of his plan, stumbled forward and crashed face first onto the cobblestones. The sound of Jason hitting the ground was sickeningly loud, the wet smack of flesh meeting stone, followed by a sharp cry of pain and surprise. His phone skittered away across the cobblestones, the screen cracking as it bounced off the curb. The live stream continued broadcasting, now showing nothing but sky and the horrified faces of tourists who had witnessed the entire incident. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Mitchell had continued his march for 3 more steps before coming to a halt, not because of any command from his superiors, but because something deeper than military protocol had kicked in. Jason lay on the ground, blood trickling from his nose and a scrape across his forehead, his expensive school blazer torn at the elbow. The crowd that had been watching with amusement suddenly felt the weight of what they had witnessed. This wasn't a harmless prank anymore. This was a young man who had humiliated himself in the most public way possible, and the collective embarrassment was palpable. Jason's friends, who had been eagerly recording what they thought would be their moment of viral fame, now found themselves uncertain of what to do. The laughter died in their throats as they realized that their leader, their source of entertainment and validation, was bleeding on the ground in front of hundreds of strangers. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd, her face a mixture of horror and fury. She had dealt with difficult students before, but nothing quite like this. As she knelt beside Jason to assess his injuries, she was already mentally composing the phone call she would have to make to his parents, and the report she would have to file with the school administration. Mitchell stood perfectly still for another 10 seconds, his training warring with his human instincts. Protocol dictated that he should continue his patrol and let the palace security handle any disturbances. But something about the sight of Jason, not the arrogant teenager who had been mocking him, but the injured young man on the ground, triggered memories that went deeper than his military conditioning. Slowly, deliberately, Mitchell turned around. The movement was precise and controlled, every inch the product of years of military bearing. But there was something else in it too, a weight that suggested this was not a decision made lightly. His eyes found Jason, who was struggling to sit up, while blood dripped from his nose onto his white school shirt. "Problem, son." Mitchell's voice carried across the forecourt with startling clarity. It wasn't loud, but it had the kind of authority That makes everyone in hearing range stop what they're doing and listen." The words themselves were simple, almost conversational, but delivered with a tone that suggested depths of experience that Jason couldn't even begin to fathom. Jason looked up, and for the first time that morning, he was genuinely speechless. Up close, Mitchell wasn't the mindless automaton Jason had imagined. His face was lean and angular, with the kind of tan that comes from spending years under foreign suns in places where comfort is a luxury and survival is a daily challenge. But it was his eyes that truly shocked Jason. They were alert, intelligent, and filled with something that made the teenager's bravado shrivel like a deflated balloon. Those eyes had seen things that Jason, in his sheltered 17 years, couldn't imagine. They had watched friends die, had seen children caught in crossfire, had stared down enemy combatants who wanted nothing more than to end his life. They had also seen acts of incredible courage and selflessness, moments of humanity that shone like beacons in the darkness of war. Mitchell took 3 measured steps toward Jason, his boots clicking on the cobblestones with the same precision they had maintained throughout his patrol. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the other guards, still maintaining their positions along the palace perimeter, seemed to be watching from their peripheral vision. Jason tried to stand, his legs shaky from both the fall and the sudden realization that he had dramatically misjudged the situation. Blood was still flowing from his nose, and his head was pounding from where it had connected with the stone. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of embarrassment and confusion he was feeling. Mitchell reached down and picked up Jason's cracked phone from where it had fallen. The screen was spiderwebbed with fractures, but it was still broadcasting live, still recording everything that was happening. The viewer count had climbed into the thousands as word spread across social media about the confrontation unfolding at Buckingham Palace. Instead of crushing the device or throwing it away, Mitchell carefully examined it for a moment, then handed it back to Jason with the same ceremony he might use to return a fallen flag. The gesture was both respectful and somehow deeply shaming. It highlighted the vast gulf between Mitchell's professionalism and Jason's childish behavior. "Your phone," Mitchell said simply, his Scottish accent becoming more apparent now that he was speaking at normal volume rather than projecting across a parade ground. "Might want to be more careful with it. Good phones are hard to come by where I've been." Jason took the device with trembling hands, acutely aware that thousands of his followers were watching this interaction in real time. The comments section was exploding with responses ranging from mockery to genuine concern. But Jason found that he no longer cared about his online audience. All of his attention was focused on the man standing in front of him. Mitchell's uniform was immaculate. Despite the early morning drill and the London pollution, every button gleamed, every crease was knife-sharp, every detail spoke of hours of meticulous preparation. But now that Jason was close enough to really look, he could see things that told a different story than the one he had assumed. There was a small ribbon bar on Mitchell's chest that Jason didn't recognize, but which any military historian would immediately identify as representing service in Afghanistan. Below it was another ribbon that spoke of commendations for bravery under fire, and barely visible beneath his collar was the edge of what looked like a significant scar, the kind that comes from shrapnel or worse. Mitchell noticed Jason staring at his uniform and decided that this moment, this teachable moment that had presented itself, was worth the risk of breaking protocol. "See this," Mitchell said, tapping the highest medal on his chest with one gloved finger. The gesture was casual, but his voice carried the weight of everything that small piece of metal represented. "Queen's Gallantry Medal. Earned it pulling 2 kids from a bombed school in Kabul. They were about your age, actually." The crowd around them had grown larger, but somehow also quieter. Tourists who had come expecting a photo opportunity found themselves witnessing something much more profound. Several people had their phones out, but unlike Jason's earlier performance, this felt sacred rather than exploitative. Jason's mouth opened and closed silently. In his privileged world of private schools and weekend house parties, he had never encountered someone who had genuinely risked their life for others. The concept was so foreign to his experience that he struggled to process it. Mitchell continued, his voice steady but filled with memories that Jason couldn't see but could somehow feel. "These boots," he said, stamping one foot against the cobblestones, with enough force to make Jason flinch, "marched 40 miles carrying a wounded mate when the medevac couldn't land. Taliban had shot down our chopper support, and we had 3 hours to get him to an aid station before he bled out. The sound of that boot hitting the ground seemed to echo longer than physics would suggest. It was the sound of authority earned through sacrifice, of respect commanded through service, of a life lived in ways that most people, certainly most 17-year-old private school students, would never understand. "So no, lad," Mitchell continued, his eyes never leaving Jason's face. "We're not robots. We're not mindless automatons following orders because we're too stupid to think for ourselves. We're the reason you get to stand here and act like one, without consequence." The words hit Jason like physical blows. Each sentence stripped away another layer of the arrogance that had protected him from having to think seriously about the world beyond his own immediate desires. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with someone who had earned the right to judge him and found him wanting. Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, her hand over her mouth, tears beginning to form in her eyes. In 20 years of teaching, she had never seen a student receive such a profound lesson in humility and respect. Mitchell was preparing to turn and resume his duties when Jason's voice stopped him. It was barely more than a whisper, cracked with emotion and the realization of how badly he had misjudged everything. I didn't know." The words hung in the air between them, simple but carrying the weight of genuine recognition. It wasn't an apology. Jason was still too overwhelmed to formulate something that coherent, but it was acknowledgement. For the first time that morning, he was seeing Mitchell as a human being rather than a target for his entertainment. Mitchell paused, his hand already moving to return to the position of attention that would signal his return to duty. Something in Jason's voice, some quality of genuine shock and dawning understanding, made him reconsider. This wasn't just another privileged teenager who had learned nothing from being put in his place. This was someone who was genuinely processing new information about the world and his place in it. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Mitchell smiled. It wasn't a cruel expression or a mocking one. It was the kind of smile that an older brother might give to a younger sibling who had just learned an important but difficult lesson. "Course you didn't," Mitchell said, his voice noticeably gentler now. "But now you do." He nodded toward the palace behind him, where the other guards were still maintaining their positions with the same unwavering discipline they had shown throughout the entire incident. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jason. As Mitchell turned to rejoin his patrol, something extraordinary occurred. The other guards, men who had been standing at perfect attention throughout the entire confrontation, simultaneously turned their heads toward Mitchell and rendered a crisp salute. It was a gesture of respect from one professional soldier to another, an acknowledgement that Mitchell had handled a difficult situation with exactly the kind of dignity and restraint that their uniform demanded. Jason's jaw dropped open as he witnessed this display of solidarity and respect. In his world, such gestures of genuine admiration were rare and usually performed for show rather than from authentic feeling. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer to Jason, who was beginning to understand that he had witnessed something significant. These weren't just men playing dress-up for tourists. They were professionals who held each other to standards that Jason was only beginning to comprehend. As Mitchell resumed his position and began marching again, his steps falling back into that hypnotic rhythm, Jason remained standing where he was, his cracked phone forgotten in his hands. The live stream was still broadcasting, but the comments had changed dramatically from mocking laughter to expressions of respect for the guard and shame for Jason's behavior. Mrs. Henderson approached Jason carefully, as if he were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She had seen students have revelations before, but rarely so publicly or so dramatically. "Jason," she said softly, "we should get you cleaned up and perhaps have the school nurse look at that cut on your head." Jason nodded absently, but his eyes remained fixed on Mitchell's retreating figure. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world, and he was struggling to process the magnitude of that change. Over the following days, Jason found himself thinking obsessively about the encounter. He researched military medals online and learned that the Queen's Gallantry Medal was awarded for exemplary acts of bravery, typically in situations where lives were at immediate risk. He read about the war in Afghanistan and began to understand the context in which Mitchell had earned his decorations. The video of his humiliation had indeed gone viral, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of becoming famous for a guard, he had become notorious for his arrogance and the profound way he had been put in his place. The comments sections were filled with people praising Mitchell's restraint and professionalism while criticizing Jason's behavior, but rather than becoming defensive or angry about the negative attention, Jason found himself agreeing with his critics the more he learned about military service and the sacrifices that people like Mitchell had made, the more ashamed he became of his behavior. 3 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Jason made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He walked into a military recruitment office in central London and inquired about joining the Army Cadets program. The recruiting sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Williams who had seen countless young men come through his doors with fantasies of military glory, was initially skeptical. "What makes you think you're cut out for military service, son?" Williams asked. Studying Jason's expensive clothes and soft hands, Jason pulled out his phone and showed Williams the video of his encounter with Mitchell. The sergeant watched in silence, his expression unreadable. "That's me," Jason said quietly. "That's who I was. I want to be more like him." Williams nodded slowly. He had seen genuine remorse before, and he recognized it in Jason's voice and posture. "It's not easy," he warned. "Military discipline isn't a game. It's about sacrifice, service, and putting others before yourself. Are you ready for that?" Jason thought about Mitchell's words, about the medals on his chest and the scars hidden beneath his uniform. He thought about the respect that the other guards had shown him and the quiet dignity with which he had handled a difficult situation. "I want to try," Jason said. 1 month after that conversation, Jason stood at attention in his new Army Cadets uniform outside Buckingham Palace. It was part of a community service program where the cadets assisted with crowd control during peak tourist seasons. The uniform was different from Mitchell's, simpler, marking him as a trainee rather than a full guardsman, but Jason wore it with a pride he had never felt in his expensive school blazer. As he stood at his post, maintaining the discipline and bearing he had been learning over the past weeks, he saw a familiar figure approaching. Mitchell was returning from his patrol route, his step as measured and precise as ever. As he passed Jason's position, he slowed almost imperceptibly. Their eyes met for just a moment. No words were exchanged. Protocol demanded silence from both of them, but Mitchell gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. It was barely visible to anyone watching, but to Jason, it felt like the highest commendation he had ever received. Later that evening, Jason posted a new video to his social media accounts. Instead of pranks or mockery, it was a simple message recorded in his small London flat, still wearing his cadet uniform. "A month ago, I thought I was funny," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I thought disrespecting people who serve our country was entertainment. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Real courage isn't about making others look foolish. It's about standing up when it matters, even when no one's watching. I'm learning that now, and I hope someday I'll be worthy of the uniform I'm wearing." The video received thousands of views and hundreds of supportive comments, but Jason found that the online validation that had once been so important to him now seemed hollow compared to the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was becoming someone he could respect.